By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world.
That shot heard round the world, fired by the embattled farmers of Lexington and Concord, was a call to arms to New England communities. West Hartford answered that call in the spirit of the words "to look after liberty," which are now the motto on our town flag. Like the people of Concord and Lexington, the people of West Hartford felt that the new imperial policy being imposed upon them by the home government in Great Britain was a threat to their whole way of life. What were these threats? Number one, the increased enforcement of the Navigation Acts, the tea tax, the duties laid on many kinds of goods to be paid in scarce cash, the closing of the port of Boston, the suspension of many forms of local government, including town meetings. All these things were felt to be a threat to the whole way of life. But the people of West Hartford knew what to do. Like the inhabitants of many other communities, they were used to bearing arms, and for many years they had had a local militia company, which used to drill on the village green, very much like this. When the news of struggle came, they sprang to arms, and they organized a militia company. Now, when these Minutemen, local militiamen, went off to war, they simply went in their ordinary clothing, because early in the war, there were no regular uniforms. In this painting by Charles Lefferts, you see them dressed in their multicolored clothing, their colored coats and breeches, carrying their long rifles, wearing their three-cornered hats. You notice their heavy woolen stockings and heavy shoes, and you see at the left a man who is carrying a powder horn. This is the muster roll of the Special Militia Company organized in response to the call to arms in April 1775. At the head of the column of names is that of Abraham Sedgwick, who was the captain of the company. If you read down the column, you will discover there names of many of the families that settled in West Hartford in colonial times, and some of the families are still with us. One of the names you should note is that of young Thomas Hart Hooker, who was a direct descendant of the Reverend Thomas Hooker, the founder of Hartford. He and his young wife, Sarah Whitman, lived in a house that still stands today in West Hartford. Another young soldier who served early in the war was Moses Goodman. It gives me a great thrill to hold in my hand the yellowed letter he wrote in October 1775 from camp at Roxbury, Massachusetts, to his brother Thomas in West Hartford. In it, he describes the difficulties General Washington was having in holding his army together and in getting men to re-enlist. We must remember that many of the soldiers were militiamen who enlisted for short periods, and then, when the periods were over, often simply took off and went home. The letter reads, "Dear brother,"
hoping these lines will find you and yours well and in good health, as they leave me by the goodness of God. It is a general time of health in the camp, General Washington has given out orders for our Connecticut forces to enlist till the 6th of January, but it don't suit very well. I believe there won't many list. There is other orders coming out for to enlist men for 12 months. There will a good many list then, but not enough. I have a notion to enlist for the year, and now ask your advice. Please to write as soon as you can. I have no news to write, only Lieutenant Wadsworth of Farmington is dead. He died in the house that our company was stationed at. He was buried very decently. Such a funeral I never saw before. I shall tire your patience no longer at present. From your friend and brother, Moses Goodman. And give my compliments to Mrs. Eunice.
There is a tradition that Moses Goodman, in the bitter winter of 1778, rode all the way to the American Army camp at Valley Forge, carrying in his saddlebags $30,000 that had been raised in this area for the relief of Washington's cold and hungry troops. This picture shows one of his descendants, little Virginia Selden, holding the leather saddlebags in which he is said to have carried the money. And here in my hands are those same saddlebags, and you can still see them occasionally on exhibit at the museum in the Noah Webster House. In June 1775, West Hartford was greatly agitated because the Americans had decided to send an expedition up to Canada to take it from the British. The Americans were very apprehensive that the British would organize an expedition in Canada to invade the 13 states by way of the Hudson Valley. In support of this expedition, West Hartford raised a company of soldiers. And on that occasion, on June 2nd, 1775, the soldiers and the people assembled in the meeting house to listen to a rousing patriotic sermon by the Reverend Nathan Perkins. Perkins began by asserting the right of the pulpit to speak on political questions. He then reviewed the development of the political liberties of New England, which he and many other people thought were being endangered by the new imperial policy. And finally, he launched into a scathing attack upon the new oppressive policy of the king and his ministers towards the colonies. Perkins preached from a pulpit very much like this one.
We have reasoned, we have remonstrated, we have prayed, we have even wearied the royal ear with our cries. We have pursued every respectful, every gentle measure, but all in vain. We must be scourged into vassalage like slaves. We have been dragged reluctantly into an unnatural civil war. Hostilities are commenced, and the king's troops, the instruments of tyranny, were the aggressors. Witness the battle at Lexington, shameful in every view to the British arms. We are reduced to the sad, deprecated necessity of defending our rights at the point of the sword. We must either resist unto blood or be slaves. No other alternative is left us. As ours is then a defensive, it must be a righteous war.
Well, if any British officer had been present in the congregation when that rousing sermon was delivered, the Reverend Nathan Perkins probably would have been arrested and put in jail. One of the young men in the parish who was aroused by Nathan Perkins' patriotic sermon was Lieutenant Basie Wells. He lived on the east slope of Avon Mountain, where Route 44 is now. He enlisted in the West Hartford Company of soldiers who were to go on the expedition to capture Canada. And he kept a very fascinating diary of his experiences in which he recorded his enlistment in the West Division, that is West Hartford, and recorded the marches of the troops day by day, the places where they camped, and he gives many fascinating details of the life of a soldier during the period of the Revolutionary War. And believe me, it was no picnic.
At about dark, We took to our oars and rowed until daylight of the 26th, then drew our boat up into the bushes about 6 rods and hid our provisions and rum in different places. We swung our packs and took to the woods, traveled a northwest course until 10 in the morning and came to a river where we took breakfast. We napped till 12, then mounted packs again and traveled till sunset, then made a fire and took up lodgings. It rained almost all night. The 27th, we mounted packs again about half after 6 and traveled till about 11. Then it began to rain and rain as hard as ever I saw it. After an hour, we were as wet as water could make us.
Basie Wells was something more than simply an officer of American troops. Actually, at one time, he served as a spy in Canada, spying out the disposition of the British troops. He became very ill and had to have extensive medical treatment. I found in the State Library a claim which he put in for his medical expenses, attested to by 2 physicians and also by Noah Webster Sr. as a Justice of the Peace. I might add that the committee turned him down cold. You will recall the young soldier Thomas Hart Hooker, who went off to fight in the Revolution early in the war. This is the house where he lived with his young wife, Sarah Whitman Hooker. It is now being restored by the West Hartford Bicentennial Trust, Incorporated. As the reconstruction work proceeds, we begin to see more and more of the construction and character of this house, including the great fireplace, the big hewn beam over it, the hearth, the ovens, and the old beamwork, and over here, the old-fashioned paneling. During the years 1775 and 1776, this house was used as a place of imprisonment for Tories. Now, the Patriots were very eager to round up Tories because many of them were considered very dangerous to the American cause. They might be suppliers, or they might go roaming around enlisting troops for the King's army. One of the Tories who was imprisoned in the house was Governor Philip Skene. He was at one time the governor of Crown Point, Ticonderoga, and Montreal. He was brought here and placed under house arrest and was under parole not to leave the bounds of Hartford. Several other Tories also were imprisoned here, including his son, Major Andrew Philip Skene. In January 1776, Skene gave a party for some of his Tory friends in and around Hartford. They came out to the Hooker house in a sled, which was driven by a British officer, Captain Mackay, and on the way out he was hallooing at the horses. The Patriots along the way thought that Skene's fellow Tories were rejoicing because of the American failure to capture Quebec in December 1775. Well, when they got to the house, they sat down to dinner with Skene, and after dinner they were going to have a jolly time playing a game of whist. In the midst of the game, a servant came in, telling them that in a house across the street there was a group of about 20 West Hartford Patriots who were intending to mob them. The Tories took refuge on the second floor of the house, determined to defend themselves to the last rather than be insulted, as Major Christopher French tells us in his diary. Meanwhile, Abraham Sedgwick, the captain of the Hartford militia, was across the street trying to persuade the enraged Patriots to go home. The lady of the house, Sarah Whitman Hooker, also went over, and they finally convinced the mob to go home. Evidently, Captain Sedgwick did not want any mobbing or any tarring and feathering or any other scandal in West Hartford. The next morning, a committee came out from Hartford to take the Tory prisoners and put them in jail. In the summer of 1776, the American cause had run into very serious difficulties. General Sir William Howe arrived off New York with a large army, which he encamped on Staten Island. Later, he took his troops over to Long Island, where Brooklyn is now, and there, in the Battle of Long Island, defeated the American troops, who were forced to retire into the island of Manhattan and eventually from there over into New Jersey. They escaped across New Jersey under the lead of General Washington. Getting the army out of the trap was a very skillful and typically Washingtonian feat. Fighting with the British troops in the Battle of Long Island was a company of Jaegers, a corps of German troops from the state of Hesse-Kassel. You will remember that during the Revolution, the British government hired troops from Germany to fight in the war in America. Jaeger means a pursuer or hunter. This picture shows German Jaegers in their uniforms, privates, and an officer in parade dress. Among the Connecticut troops at the Battle of Long Island was a young West Hartford man, Jonathan Gillette, who was captured by Jaegers and held aboard a prison ship. We still have this letter he wrote to his wife while in prison.
My friends, I was made a prisoner the 27th day of August past by a people called Hessians and by a party called Jaegers, the most inhuman of all mortals. I can't give room to picture them here, but this much. I at first resolved not to be taken, but by the importunity of the 7 taken with me and being surrounded on all sides by numbers, I unhappily surrendered. Would to God I never had. Then I should never have known their unmerciful cruelties. They first disarmed me, then plundered me of all I had, watch, buckles, money, and some clothing, after which they abused me by bruising my flesh with the butts of their guns. They first knocked me down. I got up, and they kept beating me almost all the way to their camp, where I was almost starved to death by them. I was kept there 8 days, then sent on board a ship, where I have been used much worse than when on shore.
Later on, he put in a claim for his losses, and I am pleased to report that I found in the Revolutionary documents at the State Library his claim, and the fact that he was paid in full. This is the birthplace and early home of Noah Webster Jr. Besides being famous for his blueback speller and his monumental dictionary, Noah was also a soldier. You will recall that the first expedition of West Hartford militia in 1775 went north to Canada to prevent the British from invading New York State. 2 years later, that's exactly what they did, led by General Burgoyne. He came down by way of the Lake Champlain route to the Hudson River. It was a long and tedious operation. Some of his troops deserted, and eventually at Saratoga, New York, he was hemmed in by American militiamen and regular American troops. Among the troops who went up to oppose General Burgoyne's invasion was a company of militia from West Hartford headed by Noah's father, Noah Webster Sr. In that company was Noah Jr. But before they got to Saratoga, they heard the joyful news that General Burgoyne had surrendered his entire army, and so they saw no action. And that is fortunate, because if Noah Jr. hadn't returned, who knows who the Webster Dictionary might have been named after. When the news of Burgoyne's surrender reached West Hartford, a group of people in Elmwood planted some elm saplings on a small triangular plot between the branches of South Quaker Lane, where it joined New Britain Avenue. The trees grew over a century to reflect the strength and vigor of West Hartford's revolutionary fervor. As I walk over these dead leaves, I think of the soldiers who camped here, those who were sick here, those who died here, because now I'm standing on the east slope of Avon Mountain, a little north of Route 44, the extension of Albany Avenue. This was a revolutionary campsite. Here, for a few days in November 1778, camped the troops of General Putnam on their way from Hartford to Danbury. This might have been a well or cistern in the camp, and these semicircles of stones here are the remains of fireplaces. There is also some evidence that this site may have been used as a hospital camp. And for evidence, we have this old account book kept by Simeon Newell of Farmington, who was the commissary of the hospital here. In it, page after page, are entries for supplies he bought from West Hartford farmers. The book begins the day after Putnam's soldiers left here for Danbury. The names of the men from whom he bought the supplies were practically all those of West Hartford farmers. One of the sellers was the Reverend Nathan Perkins, from whom Newell bought milk for the camp. As you go through the pages, you notice entries for the purchase of medical supplies and food, including turnips, milk, and mutton. I imagine that the men probably never wanted to see any more turnips or mutton for the rest of their lives. From time to time, there are entries for coffins, indicating that some of the men died there. In the bill of mortality in the West Hartford church records for 1776 is this list of Revolutionary soldiers who died. The names are marked by little crosses. In this small burial ground on the east side of North Main Street, a little north of West Hartford Center, are the graves of some 20 soldiers who died in the American Revolutionary War. Only some of the graves are indicated by markers like this one. Whenever you go past here, remember these soldiers of the Revolution who died in the war for American freedom, to fulfill the ideals of the early settlers, to look after liberty. Now, what kind of liberty were they seeking? Well, now, one of the most important results of the Revolutionary War was the encouragement of a spirit of local liberty. The people were anxious to have their own local governments. And after the Revolutionary War, many of the huge old colonial towns were divided into new towns. West Hartford took an important part in this movement, and after the Revolutionary War, repeatedly tried to become a town. The final successful petition requesting local government was signed by 153 voters in 1854. The first name is Giles Goodman, the town miller. Strange as it may seem, there was also a petition against having a town government, signed by more than 90 men. They said that there was not enough population in the parish, that having a separate town government would increase taxes, and that the natural bonds of West Hartford were with the city of Hartford. As it turns out, many of those who opposed the creation of the town government had very close financial and business ties with Hartford, or they lived on roads leading into the city. Those who were in favor of town government, however, prevailed. Here is the act of the legislature incorporating the town of West Hartford in 1854. making it part of the 1st Senatorial District and the 1st Probate District, and giving us one representative in the state legislature. The first town meeting was held in June of that year, and officers were elected. In those days, they used to elect such officers as pound keepers, who kept the pound where stray animals were placed. There were also fence viewers, and so on and so on. There was an extraordinary number of town officers, about 40, when you consider that at that time West Hartford had only about 1,100 people. Well, that's the story. West Hartford's part in the Revolution and the evolution of our town government, which resulted from the spirit of freedom and local liberty that dates way back to 1711, when we became a parish and took up the challenge to look after liberty.